brother of Elrond, who had chosen mortal life. The Númenóreans were given long years, great wisdom, remarkable physical gifts. They became mariners without equal, craftsmen and scholars.
I need a key.
For a long time, they were genuinely good. But the gifts they had been given were not the gifts they wanted most. What the Númenóreans wanted was what the elves had.
I need a key.
Immortality. And the Valar had forbidden them from sailing west toward the Undying Lands. The ban of the Valar meant as a mercy, since death in Tolkien's theology is not a curse but a gift specific to men. The Númenóreans, as the centuries passed, could not see it that way. The fear of death grew, the envy of elvish immortality deepened, and around the year 2221 of the Second Age, society fractured formally into two parties. The Elendeli, the elf friends, were the smaller group. They maintained the old traditions, reverence for the Valar, friendship with the Eldar, willingness to accept the gift of men. Elendel was of the Elendeli, so were Isildur and Anarion, the great kings of Gondor and They turned their backs on them, resented elvish friendship, and pushed ever harder against the limits placed on them. They were not necessarily evil at first. They were proud, resentful, and afraid of dying, human failings that are understandable even as they corrupt. But the direction they were moving was always toward shadow. The King's men became the primary drivers of Númenórean colonial activity in Middle-earth, and the nature of that activity over the centuries darkened considerably. Part 2. The Shadow in the South. From the earliest centuries of the Second Age, Númenórean ships had been visiting Middle-earth. In those early days, the mariners who came were largely benevolent. They taught the men of the western coasts agriculture, craftsmanship, medicine, the working of metals. The native peoples revered them as almost godlike figures, immensely tall, long-lived, arriving on ships of a size and quality the men of Middle-earth could scarcely imagine. As the King's men came to dominate Númenórean colonial enterprise, the character of their presence changed fundamentally. They established harbours and fortified cities along the coasts, particularly in the south. They took what they wanted. Ikalabeth speaks of this directly. The men of Númenor settled far and wide on the shores of Middle-earth, but the majority fell into evils and follies, many becoming enamoured of darkness, oppressing the native peoples with cruelty and contempt. The greatest of their strongholds was the great natural harbour on the southern coast, its name predating even the Númenórean arrival. Its origin forgotten, its potential as a base of power was unmistakable. Umbar would remain significant for the rest of history. South of Umbar, the King's men extended deep into the southern regions, oppressed tribute and service from the peoples they made into subjects. When Sauron arrived, everything accelerated. Part of by the mid-Second Age, Sauron had established himself as the dominant dark power of Middle-earth, building Barad-dûr in Mordor and waging long wars across Eriador. The Númenórean fleet had driven him back around the year 1700 of the Second Age, an affront he neither forgot nor forgave. But in the south, where the King's men held sway and no elvish presence he found a far more receptive audience. Sauron's approach to the King's men was sophisticated. Not simply threatening them, but offering them theology. The Númenóreans' anger at the Valar, their resentment of elvish immortality, their refusal to accept the limits placed on them, all of this Sauron shaped into a coherent religious usurpers. Morgoth was the true lord of the world, from whom the Valar had stolen creation. The darkness was the natural order, and those who served it would receive power in proportion to their devotion. This was precisely what the King's men wanted to hear. It gave more than they had been conducting practice for generations. They had been turning away from the Valar. Those who acted Sauron's direct worshipping Morgoth at altars of dark sacrifice, adopting
I need a
the
key.
theology of the shadow, operating as his will and some of the vassals.
Silence must pay.
The Black Numenoreans. It's a specific term for a specific category. The ordinary king's men were already headed in a bad direction. The Black Numenoreans had arrived there. Among these, the Silmarillion names only two specifically: Aragorn. These were Black Numenorean lords who, in the closing centuries of the Second Age, rose to great power among the Galadriel in the lands south of Mordor. They used their Numenorean authority and their connection to Sauron's power to place themselves as masters over these Their ultimate fate is unrecorded, though they were almost certainly swept up in the catastrophe of the War of the Last Alliance. But they are the first named individuals in this history, and a demonstration of how the Black Numenoreans operated in practice, not as crude servants, but as political operators, who used their unique status to make themselves lords over other countries. There is one more dimension to this period that we need to address. The Silmarillion confirms explicitly the 9 men who received Rings of Power and became ring wraiths were great Numenorean lords. Tolkien's own notes state that the Witch King of Angmar was probably of Numenorean descent. Khamûl, the second most powerful ring wraith, is explicitly an Easterling. 3 Numenoreans among the 9 is in the period when the 9 rings were distributed, Sauron identified 3 lords among his Black Numenorean servants and gave them rings. They wielded great power for a time, extending their lives far beyond any natural span, dominating lesser men, building Sauron's influence across the southern and eastern regions. And then, as the shadow deepened and the rings consumed them, they faded entirely into the Ulari, the Nazgûl.
I am delighted to be here with Professor Bradley Lepper from the Ohio History Connection. Bradley, you are, as far as I can tell, one of the leading experts in the world on the Hopewell culture of the United States.
I suppose I'm one. Bad movies aren't made on purpose, and they don't happen accidentally either. Large-scale studio films are the result of years of day-to-day decision-making that slowly add up to become a finished movie. Some of them are good, the decisions are additive, it all work towards a common goal. Some aren't. The Rise of Skywalker, by all accounts, is a bad movie. It has the lowest rating of any live-action Star Wars movie.
Thank you to Novium, the team behind the Hover Pen, for supporting PBS. 2025 was the International Year of Quantum Science and Technology, in celebration of the invention of our strangest true theory 100 years ago. In 1925, quantum mechanics went from being a peculiar...
The nation of Mexico is one of the most vibrant and culturally recognizable on the planet today, boasting an enviable mix of natural beauty, art, cuisine, and a warm, welcoming people, which, perhaps unsurprisingly, result in it consistently ranking amongst the top 10 most visited countries by tourists each year. This impressive cultural offering, however, is the legacy of centuries of political, social, and economic change, which at times has been so turbulent that its impacts can still be seen and felt to this day. Like much of the rest of Latin America, Mexico has been irrevocably shaped by the interaction between the Old World and the New, when, during the 16th century, Spanish explorers arrived on its shores and initiated the largest transfer of ideas, resources, and human history. Since then, however, Mexico has undergone many profound changes that have uniquely affected it. But how did these events and outcomes change in such a way that they resulted in the nation we recognize so well today? This is the history of Mexico. The first humans to populate what would one day become the nation of Mexico, as well as the rest of the Americas, are thought to have arrived sometime between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago by crossing the Beringia land bridge that once connected North America to Asia. These people rapidly spread southward in the years that followed, before global sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, permanently cutting off the Americas from Asia around 11,000 years ago. Nevertheless, the early humans who settled in the region, historically referred to as Mesoamerica, began to flourish due to the area's abundant natural resources. These allowed for the first permanent civilizations to take hold around 2000 BC, which saw the establishment of intensive farming and pottery works. The earliest known ancient Mesoamerican civilization was that of the Olmecs, who occupied the tropical lowlands of the modern-day Mexican states of Veracruz and Tabasco. Their society, famous for its colossal stone heads, reached its zenith between 1200 and 400 BC and is considered the foundation upon which all later civilizations in Mesoamerica developed. The decline of the Olmecs by 300 BC left a power vacuum, which was filled by the rise of Teotihuacan, the first true metropolis of Mesoamerica, located in what is now the Valley of Mexico. By the middle of the first millennium AD, the city was home to around 125,000 people and featured monumental stone pyramids, such as the Pyramid of the Moon and the Pyramid of the Sun, which would become archetypal architectural forms in the region for centuries to come. A contemporary of the great Teotihuacan civilization was the Maya, who occupied much of what is now southeastern Mexico, particularly the Yucatan Peninsula, as well as parts of Belize and Guatemala. The Maya similarly built monumental stone pyramids that served as temples, and they developed a sophisticated writing system that allowed for innovations in mathematics, astronomy, and even the creation of calendars. However, as time passed, Mayan society began to fragment, with cities like Tikal and Calakmul becoming increasingly powerful and competing for dominance in the region. By the 9th century, this competition had led to political collapse, civil war, and the abandonment of many great cities. The city of Teotihuacan to the north had also fallen victim to this wider societal collapse, though its decline preceded that of the Maya by some years. Historians continue to debate the causes of these societal breakdowns, whether they were due to war, revolution, or even climate change. Out of this period of darkness emerged the Toltecs, who had previously been a client state of Teotihuacan. The Toltecs came to rule over most of Mesoamerica by the turn of the first millennium. However, it was their cultural and intellectual successors, the Aztecs, who would leave the most recognizable and ultimately defining of native Mesoamerican civilization in the region. The Aztecs were an alliance of 3 city-states centered around the Valley of Mexico: Texcoco, Tlacopan, and their own city of Tenochtitlan, which was founded in 1325 and built on a lake, accessible only by the huge man-made causeways that connected it to the shore. Home to some 200,000 people, the city was an elaborate construction of stone buildings, centered around the Great Pyramid, which formed the religious epicenter of the settlement and was the site of countless human sacrifices. Tenochtitlan served as the capital of the ever-expanding Aztec Empire, which ruled over much of central Mexico and an estimated population of 4 to 7 million. Although the empire was expanded through military conquest, it was primarily economic in nature, extracting vast wealth, making it enormously rich and the envy of many. Nothing, however, could prepare the Aztecs or the other peoples of Mesoamerica for what was about to happen in 1519. Two entirely different worlds were about to collide. The discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus at the end of the 15th century opened the doors for European exploration and exploitation of the continent. The Spanish were the first to capitalize on the opportunities that had presented themselves in the New World, and by the first decades of the 16th century, they had claimed and colonized much of the Caribbean and made inroads into parts of the South American mainland. News eventually reached the Spanish that advanced civilizations existed to the west in Mesoamerica, and so, in February 1519, launched a military expedition to the region, aiming to bring this part of the Americas under Spanish rule. Cortés Cortés' 500 men landed on the Caribbean coast and laid the foundations of Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz on the 18th of May, the first Spanish town to be established in Mexico. One problem that the Spanish did not have to face when they arrived in the New World, however, was the inability to access their favorite websites or streaming services when in a different country. But even if the internet had existed back then, they needn't have worried, thanks to NordVPN, the sponsor of this video. NordVPN is one of the best, all-encompassing online solutions for those wanting to access their favorite websites and streaming services, no matter where they are. With just the click of a button, you can connect to a server in your home country and bypass any regional restrictions, which may be preventing you from watching your favorite content. Take advantage of NordVPN's unrivaled connectivity by signing up using the link nordvpn.com/thisishistory and join the fastest VPN service in the world, allowing you to watch all your favorite content just as if you were right at home. NordVPN also offers the added benefits of built-in privacy and threat detection, which is vital if you are on the go and having to connect to unreliable public Wi-Fi. With NordVPN, your online activity is encrypted and masked, ensuring that your personal information and data are never exposed to malicious cybersecurity threats. You can sign up using the link nordvpn.com/thisishistory to get 4 months extra for 2 years. And if you decide it's not for you, you can cancel and receive a refund with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Cortés then received word of the enormous riches possessed by the Aztec Empire from many local native tribes who were forced to pay tribute to Tenochtitlan. In the hope of ridding themselves of their oppressive Aztec overlords, many native tribes, such as the Tlaxcala, offered to join Cortés' expedition and march on the events that unfolded between 1519 and 1521 culminated in Cortés' small band of Spaniards, along with their countless native allies, conquering the city of Tenochtitlan, overthrowing the last in the process. The ruined Aztec capital was renamed and rebuilt as Mexico City, which would serve as the capital of the territory of New Spain. Efforts to develop the region according to European ideals soon followed, with Spanish missionaries brought in to convert the
In the vast aridity of the Mexican desert, while the country breathed in an illusory peace, a storm was brewing, silent and merciless. They were not ordinary narcos, they were soldiers, men trained to eliminate, forged in the elite ranks of the Mexican army, now serving the Gulf Cartel. They were called Los Zetas. Their discipline was military, their violence surgical, their reputation terrifying. What began as a simple
The Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920 was a conflict of shifting alliances and assassinations, peasant revolutionaries, an attack on U.S. soil, and U.S. intervention in Mexico. The decade of struggle cost hundreds of thousands of lives, resulted in new constitutions and governments, and, for some at least, turned bandits into heroes. The seeds of the Mexican Revolution were sown in the early 20th century, in the final years of the rule of dictator Porfirio Diaz. Although his 31 years in power had brought economic modernization in Mexico, this also caused serious tensions in Mexican society. The vast majority of Mexico's 13 million people were rural peasants, and they were unhappy with Diaz's rule. This was because the countryside had become dominated by haciendas, which were big farming estates owned by a few of the rich landowners. By 1910, about 80% of villages were part of haciendas, where people worked as unskilled laborers. That left only 20% of villages where peasants controlled the land. To the peasants, the haciendas were swallowing up their land, especially native communities, and replacing their independence with low wages and poor working conditions. In 1910, these tensions boiled over. But the challenge to Diaz's power came not directly from the peasants, but from Francisco Madero, who was himself a landowner. He was supported by much of the middle class, who wanted political and electoral reform, but not an extreme revolution. Madero also wanted to get the support of the unhappy peasants as well, so he announced the San Luis Plan, which promised to give them back much of their land. On November 20th, 1910, even though he was still in exile in the US, he called on Mexicans to rise up against Diaz. After some hesitation, peasants in the state of Chihuahua did rise up and managed to defeat the federal army. At first, they followed Madero, but before long, the uprising got out of Madero's control. To contain the peasant revolution, Madero and Diaz got together and signed the Ciudad Juarez Accords for a transition of power. And after Diaz resigned, Madero won the election in November 1911. So the peasants had risen in revolt against the landowners, which had led to Madero becoming president. For Madero and the middle class, Diaz was gone and the revolution had done its job. Madero told the peasants that they had to give up their weapons before he could enact his plan to give them back their land. But the peasants refused to disarm. One of the most important peasant leaders was Emiliano Zapata, a skilled horseman from the rural state of Morelos. Under his command, the Southern Liberation Army had already begun reclaiming and redistributing land that it had seized from the haciendas. When the revolution had begun, Madero approved of Zapata, but they moved apart as Zapata became more radical and refused to disarm. Zapata envisioned a society in which armed peasants could protect their land and force the hand of the central government. When Madero promised Zapata new laws if he gave up his weapons, he replied, "It strikes me that there won't be more laws than there are guns." By November 1911, Zapata was disappointed in Madero and suspicious of his goals, so he created his own manifesto, which he called the Ayala Plan. The 15 points of the Ayala Plan became an influential call to arms from Mexican peasants. We give notice that regarding the fields, timber, and water which the landlords have usurped, the citizens who have the titles corresponding to these properties will immediately enter into possession of that real estate of which they have been despoiled by the bad faith of our oppressors and maintain at any cost, with arms in hand, the mentioned possession. By early 1912, the split between Zapata and Madero was complete. In a report to Congress, Madero was critical of the Zapatistas. Fortunately, this amorphous agrarian socialism, which for the rude intelligence of the farmers of Morelos can only take the form of sinister vandalism, has found no echo in other regions of the country. So Madero had split from Zapata's peasants, and it turned out he was wrong about peasants in the rest of the country as well, since they also began to rebel. But Madero's downfall would not come at the hands of the peasants, but from other enemies closer to home. In February 1913, Generals Bernardo Reyes and Felix Diaz, both of whom had served deposed dictator Porfirio Diaz and then rebelled against Madero, were broken out of prison. They quickly gathered 2,000 men and stormed the National Palace in Mexico City, which began the period known as the 10 Tragic Days. Madero ordered General Victoriano Huerta to crush the rebels, but Huerta was in no hurry, since he himself wanted power. Instead, Huerta negotiated with Diaz since Reyes had been killed in the fighting. They agreed to overthrow Madero together, after which Huerta would take power. This agreement was signed at the American Embassy, since controversial U.S. Ambassador Henry Lane Wilson supported the coup in the hopes that Huerta would bring stability and protect U.S. business interests in Mexico. Wilson later explained his poor opinion of Madero. Madero was a person of unsound intellect, of imperfect education and vision. He came into power as an apostle of liberty, but he was simply a man of disoriented intellect who happened to be in the public eye at the psychological moment. In the last days of his government, during the bombardment of the capital, his mental qualities, always abnormal, developed into a homicidal, dangerous form of lunacy. Just days after the coup, the soldiers escorting Madero and his vice president to prison killed them. Their deaths triggered insurrection in the countryside and resistance from the middle class, which was not happy about a democratically elected president being overthrown and then murdered. Opposition to Huerta now took the form of a group calling themselves the Constitutionalists. This group of opponents included politicians, generals, and peasant leaders, and they were led by politician Venustiano Carranza and General Álvaro Obregón. In early 1914, the Constitutionalist Army won a series of victories against Huerta's federal army. Things got even worse for Huerta when the United States military showed up. On April 21, 1914, U.S. Marines occupied the port city of Veracruz after a dispute involving the arrest of some U.S. sailors. The port was the main source of Huerta's military supplies and was now cut off. Huerta tried to convince the constitutionalists that the American imperialists were attacking both sides in the Mexican conflict, but to no avail. But U.S. troops remained in Veracruz, and the Constitutionalist Army continued its attacks against Huerta's federal army and reached Mexico City in July. Huerta went into exile, and Carranza took over the government in August 1914. So between 1910 and 1914, power in Mexico had gone from Diaz to Madero to Huerta and now to Carranza. But the most famous figure to emerge from the chaos was someone else, the bandit-turned-general Pancho Villa. Francisco Villa, also known as Pancho, was one of the most important figures in the Mexican Revolution. He had been a bandit and a horse thief, but in 1910, he began to lead peasant guerrillas against the Diaz dictatorship. His army, the División del Norte, or Northern Division, played an important role in overthrowing Diaz and then formed the backbone of Carranza's constitutionalist forces. Villa's troops won numerous victories against Huerta's federal army, which made him an icon to the northern peasantry. In addition to his military success, his unique character also drew attention. Journalist John Reed described him this way: "He is the most natural human being I ever saw. Natural in the sense of being nearest to a wild animal. He says almost nothing and seems so quiet as to be almost diffident. If he isn't smiling, he's looking gentle, all except his eyes, which are never still and full of energy and brutality." Villa soon allied himself with fellow peasant revolutionary Zapata, and part of what united them was a distrust of Carranza and the middle class. Both groups had cooperated against Diaz and Huerta, but there were tensions. Once Huerta was defeated in 1914, the constitutionalist leaders met to discuss the future. Carranza wanted the convention to confirm his rule and end the violence, but things soon went in another direction. The more radical peasant delegations, including the Zapatistas and Villistas, adopted Zapata's land reform plan and demanded Carranza's resignation, but Carranza refused, and General Álvaro Obregón supported him. The alliance between Carranza and the peasant leaders against Huerta was now broken, and Carranza and Obregón fled Mexico City for Córdoba in Veracruz. Villa and Zapata then attacked Mexico City and captured it in December 1914. The peasant rebels now walked the corridors of power, an unusual situation for most of them. Writer Martín Luis Guzmán described the scene as Zapata's brother, Eufemio, gave a tour of the National Palace. "We went up the staircase of honor. As he claimed each step, with his tight, wide-seamed trousers, his drill shirt open below the waist, and his excessively broad sombrero, he seemed to symbolize the historic days through which we were living. For his boorish, not humble figure contrasted with the refinement and culture heralded by the staircase. An ambassador would have moved respectfully up these stairs. Eufemio moved like a young stableman who thinks he will suddenly become president." Peasant revolutionaries had conquered the capital, but neither Villa nor Zapata claimed power. Their priority was regional power and land reform, not running the whole country. Pancho Villa himself summed it up to Zapata this way: "I am a fighter, not a statesman. I'm not educated enough to be president. I only learned to read and write properly 2 years ago. How could I, who never went to school, hope to be able to talk to foreign ambassadors and the cultivated gentlemen of Congress? It would be bad for Mexico if an uneducated man were to be president." Villa and Zapata believed that national power ought to rest with the representative of the middle class and supported Eulalio Gutiérrez as the interim president, and this faction became known as the Conventionists. So as 1915 began, there were two governments in Mexico: the Constitutionalists under Carranza and Obregón, and their former allies, the Conventionists under Gutiérrez, with the support of the peasants. The revolution now became a civil war. Villa and Zapata's forces now held the advantage, and there were some calls for marching on Carranza's stronghold in Veracruz. But neither peasant leader wanted to advance too far from their bases in Chihuahua and Morelos. There were other internal tensions amongst the conventionists as well. Many opposed peasant
whatever the cost may be. The fight on the beaches, the fight on the landing grounds, the fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall never surrender.
I'm Victor Davis Hanson. I'm a senior fellow in classics and military history at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and I'm a teaching fellow, a visiting professor at Hillsdale College. This is my 15th year that I've had the pleasure of teaching at Hillsdale. And I'm also the author of the recent Second World Wars. And today I'd like to talk about the role of air power in the course of World War II. World War II, of course, is the word we use in America, and it's equivalent to the European or the British notion of a Second World War. There's a couple of things to remember about air power before we begin in earnest. One is that there was an enormous transformation between its inaugural appearance in 1914 in World War I, when pilots in biplanes shot revolvers at each other. In less than 30 years, about 25 years, 24 years, at the outbreak in September 1st of 1939 in World War II, we had monoplanes and the speeds had increased from 100 miles an hour to nearly 300, and people were firing about 700 to 800 shots per minute on machine guns, sometimes right through the propeller, sometimes on the wings. And they were carrying bomb loads, in the case of fighter bombers, of 500 to 1,000 pounds, and bombers even far greater. So there was a miraculous transformation in the role of air power. And that created theorists or prophets, air prophets, or architects of air power, so to speak, in the European countries and in the United States as well. Billy Mitchell, Duet, Weaver in Germany. And they were so enthralled by this new weapon that they made a series of astounding predictions, and so much that Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin in the late 1930s said in despair that the bomber will always get through. And it was almost as if assets at sea, navies, and assets on the ground, infantry, were going to be secondary or even irrelevant. The war would take place up in the air. The problem with that is nobody lives up in the air, nobody eats in the air, nobody really can fly. We don't have wings. So what you're doing is transferring labor and capital from the ground up into the air, and there has to be a purpose for that. And the purpose had to be either air superiority or air supremacy. And by that I mean your air forces had to beat the other person's air forces for the prime reason that they could then direct their assets to where things really mattered on the ground, taking cities or territory, or killing people or capturing them on the ground. If you couldn't do that and you only achieved air parity, then both sides were sort of wasting their time in an irrelevant theater. So the purpose was to build more planes and train better pilots to destroy the enemy's air assets, or at least weaken them so you had air superiority. And then the holy grail was air supremacy. That meant that you could put your assets up in the air, they could fly over the enemy's territory, destroy his cities or his armies on the ground, and they would be invulnerable because you had destroyed the enemy's ability to fight back in the air. And that was pretty much the theory of air power in World War II. There's a couple of other very important concepts to remember about World War II in general that apply in particular to air power. The war was known as a series of wars from September 1939 to the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. And by that I mean they still referred, they being the general public, to the World War I as the Great War. It was only after the invasion of the Soviet Union and 6 months later, the subsequent declaration of war on the United States by Germany and Italy, as well as 4 days earlier, the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, that it was conceived as a global war that had replaced World War I, and now it became World War II. It's a very important concept, you see, because there was a method to the Axis victories before 1941. Germany invades Poland, Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Holland, Belgium, France, and Yugoslavia. And in those 9 victories, there were commonalities. They were all surprise attacks. They were all conducted against neighbors, and they were all waged by Germany and, to a lesser extent later, Italy, against neighbors who were not fully prepared. In other words, they had felt that the war to end all wars that ended in 1918 would ensure perpetual peace. In the case of the British, and the French, they thought appeasement, or the idea of giving in to Hitler or Mussolini, would temper their territorial ambitions. In the case of the United States, they felt to be isolationist was much wiser, not to get entangled in Europe's problems. In the case of the Soviet Union, it was active collusion under the Non-Aggression Pact of August 1939 that meant that they would supply material to the Axis powers, Germany especially, and then in exchange they wouldn't have a war with the Soviet Union, but they would direct their attention to destroying capitalist democracies in Europe. But the final result of all this was people made wrong impressions. They said, my gosh, Germany just wins. Blitzkrieg, this combined use of tanks and rapid motorized transport, and Juncker's 87 dive bombing attacks, and Dorner's 17 level bombing. This is amazing. You can't stop this juggernaut.
Poland and the world learn the meaning of a grim new word, Blitzkrieg. And its doom is sealed. On September 1st, Danzig is incorporated into the Reich, and all Europe is aflame. World War II is a reality. Nazi regulars...
But nobody ever stopped and took a deep breath and said, has Germany's air power, along with its ground forces, has it ever really encountered an enemy that it didn't surprise attack, that was ready for it? Is it able to go vast distances, not just across the border into Poland or into France, but 1,500 miles to the Volga River? Can it reach the United States? Can it reach even Britain, that's an island? And the answers were increasingly apparent that for all of the formidable air assets of Germany, it could not do that. The second general theme of air power in World War II was the Allies, and by the Allies, I'm mostly talking about the alliance that emerged after 1941, and that was the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States. That group of allies emphasized practicality and numbers. In other words, if they build a tank or an airplane, the overriding rationale was, is it durable? Is it easily maintained? Is it easily operated? Is it cheap to produce? In opposition to that, Germany and Japan had a very different concept. We have to build the biggest ship, or we'll conceive of the biggest bomber, or we have to have the closest calibrations on our cylinder head and piston, or we have to have the finest craftsmanship. And the net result was that in theory, a German fighter or a Japanese fighter might have superior maneuverability or rate of ascent in 1939, 40, and 41, but it did not have the numbers or the pilot training or the support network to ensure there would be more planes in the air than the enemy. And so what happened is Germany declared war in 39 with a wonderful air arm, the Luftwaffe, and it had been seriously training and in production and organized from about 1937, even though it had been outlawed by the Versailles Treaty. But its enemies in Europe had not been doing much at all. So it found it very easy to achieve not just air superiority, but air supremacy. By 1939, it went into Poland. It was bombing Warsaw within 4 or 5 days without serious opposition in the air. When it went into Denmark, it it overran the country in 4 days. Norway was a little bit more difficult because for the first time it encountered elements of the Royal Air Force of Great Britain, but nevertheless it was much closer and it had more assets and it defeated the British in Norway. In the case of France, case of Yugoslavia, the Low Countries, Greece, again, it was fighting a neighbor that was proximate and was surprised and had not fully armed to the extent that Germany had by 1939 and 1940. And this created an aura of invincibility. No one asked in Great Britain or the Soviet Union or the United States simple questions. For example, is the Messerschmitt Bf 109 the superb German fighter that had done so well in Poland, the Low Countries, and the European conflicts around Germany, was it actually superior to any other fighter that Great Britain could put in the air, specifically the Spitfire fighter, Supermarine Spitfire? Was it better than anything the United States had? For example, in terms of fighters, was it better than the P-40? Perhaps. Was it better than the Wildcat fighter? Perhaps. But was it better than things that were going to emerge very quickly, like the P-38 Lockheed and soon the P-47, and people were even dreaming of a P-51? And the answer was not clear. And more importantly, people did not ask a second question. When you fight an existential war, the question must be, do you have the ability to destroy the enemy's means of production? Now, obviously, when Germany went into Poland, and they went into France, or they went into Yugoslavia and Greece, they had enough air superiority that they could destroy these regional air forces and then bomb strategic targets and then enforce terms on the defeated. But that was a very different question than saying to the Russians, we have air superiority to such a degree that we can go all the way to Moscow or Stalingrad or Leningrad and destroy your cities. That's a very different proposition. You have to have forward-based fields, you have to have a superb trained mechanics that will go with your airplanes far away from Germany's borders, and you also must have reliable fuel supplies. Can you attack the United States? Can you send a bomber 3,000 miles and hit New York? Can you even bomb London systematically to such a degree that you'll destroy its means of production? And the answer of that was pretty clear by 1940, 39 and 40, the answer was no. And why was the answer of no? If you look at the strategic decisions that were made in air power, the most alarming for Germany was they never built a bomber with 4 engines. Now, of course, they had superb 2-engine bombers. The Junkers and the Döners and the Heinkel models were all very good airplanes. But a median bomber with 2 engines cannot carry more than 4,000 or 5,000 pounds of explosive. A 4-engine bomber, you can double that load and you can double the range. Why didn't Germany do that? And part of the reason was it was so successful that it envisioned war as one of conquering neighbors in the general vicinity of Europe. And then, of course, other powers would be so impressed or awed, they'd say, we can't defeat Germany, let's come to terms with it. So the United States or Great Britain, the Soviet Union, would make a deal rather than face the onslaught of the Luftwaffe. There was another couple of reasons. The Germans got in their mind early in the 1930s that dive bombing, taking bombers and diving down on the ground rather than going higher in the air, ensured greater accuracy. That was a flawed concept, as you can see, because the idea of taking a 4-engine or 2-engine bomber down to the ground and putting it within range of flak batteries was sort of crazy. And then the third flawed concept was Germany felt that you could put 2 engines behind each other and on one drive shaft. So you would only have 2, what they called nacelles, 2 engines that were exposed, and that would have less drag, but they would be so powerful they would sort of have the speed and the efficiency of a 4-engine bomber. All of those concepts turned out to be flawed, and Germany went in the war in 1939 without a bomber that could really deliver a sustainable load to Great Britain, at least enough firepower to destroy its means of production. It could not reach the United States, and it could not reach the Soviet Union. And the same was true of Italy, and the same was true of Japan. Italy, in the case of directing its efforts in the Balkans, Japan fighting since 1931 on and off in Manchuria, and then later China, and then later in Southeast Asia. Again, the same formula applied. Easy victories due to surprise attack, superior preparation in the 1930s, and proximity. None of those factors applied to fighting in a whole array of new challenges after 1941, and that was the great distances of the Soviet Union, crossing the ocean to hit the United States, and defeating superior British air power and naval power to conquer the island of Great Britain. So somewhere around 1941 to 1942, the Axis powers recalibrated, and they said, my gosh, we're now in a war with the United States since December 11, 1941. We are in a war with the Soviet Union since June 21st of 1941, and we never conquered Great Britain. And we have not been able to bomb the enemy into submission, or even in some cases, even reach the enemy. So then, what happened? Well, what happened would be then that there were two races, so to speak, concurrent races. In Japan and Italy and Germany, they recalibrated their strategic and industrial policy. Can we make a fighter that is so much better than anything that the Allies have? Can we have a new weapon? Can we have a new bomber that can somehow rectify our tragic mistake of taking on economic, industrial, and military powers beyond our comprehension in 1941? There was an active discussion both in Germany and in Japan that something had gone wrong. These border wars have been so successful in China, Southeast Asia, Europe, have now blossomed into something they hadn't quite conceived of. And the answer, as we're going to see, is going to be no. They did not build a four-engine bomber. They did not build fighters that were capable of ensuring air supremacy, and they did not train pilots or maintenance crews that would ensure air supremacy. Meanwhile, in the United States and Great Britain and the Soviet Union, there were quantum leaps in technology and industrial production. And remember one other thing, is that the United States was 3,000 miles distant from Europe. Great Britain was always an island. So even though through isolationism and appeasement, the democracies were not really ready for World War II, there were people within them that understood, would there ever be another war, you would have to have a means of hitting a European city that was hostile with bombs from your own home bases, whether it was the United States or whether it would be in Britain. And that created a need for a four-engine bomber. So as early as 1936 and 1937, the United States had developed this wonderful B-17 bomber. And Britain had experimented with a handling page of the Stirling short bomber. Again, four-engine bombers were built as early as 1937 to 39 in the democracies, and the Axis had no counterpart to that. And that gave them a head start, because from the B-17 you would get the B-24, and then later the B-29, and from the Stirling short or the handling page you would go to the Manchester and then the Lancaster. So by 1944 and 45, when we talk about strategic bombing, we're essentially talking about an Allied phenomenon. The Axis powers did not have the equipment, the technology, the training, or the expertise, and they simply ceased even trying to do it. As far as fighters go, the same concept holds true, that the United States and Britain, as being island and distant powers, and to some extent the Soviet Union, started to put a premium on distance and concepts like usable, reusable, or drop tanks, so that a fighter could have its regular gasoline tank, but also could have one that would drop when it got a sufficient distance in enemy combat. So the ranges for Allied aircraft started to exceed 150, 200, 300, 400, 500 miles that were allowed them to escort bombers all over. So when we look at the individual fighters on the two sides of the conflict, by 1941, everything is starting to flip to reverse. The wonderful Messerschmitt 109 and the new Focke-Wulf 190 are now being matched in the United States by P-47, P-38, especially a P-51 fighter that is superior in every category. In Britain, the Supermarine Spitfire will go through iterations from Model 1 to 9. Very quickly, it will match the 109 and the 190 and even become far more versatile. 90% of the aviation fuel in World War II was produced and refined either on the British or American offices. So you had more fuel. If you have more fuel, you have more time to train crews. There will be a 10-to-1 advantage in personnel in the Army Air Forces in Britain, United States. In other words, they will have more fuel and they'll have more money and more time to train crews, not with 10 or 20 hours, but 50, 100, 300 hours of training before they enter combat. This will all come to fruition about 1943, in which the Allies will essentially destroy the Luftwaffe and destroy the Japanese naval and Army Air Forces. At the same time this is happening, the Americans are starting to believe that they can send these unique four-engine bombers, and Britain can, and go into the continent of Europe and thereby avoid a land war. Why would they want to avoid a land war? Because they're haunted, in the case of Britain, by the Verdun battle or the Somme battles of World War I. Horrible casualties, 1 million British dead, 1.5 million French dead, and they don't want to repeat that. And the architects of air power have said, you know what, a four-engine bomber can go to Germany or occupied France or Eastern Europe and do what a land army could do without the commiserate casualties. Japan, to a certain extent, had the same idea, that it had not built a four-engine bomber, it only had fighters, and the United States then would only reach Japan through air power. It would have to have bases.
I just want to say this at the beginning today, since I have a lot of newer subscribers, and not everyone watches to the end screen. If you want to support this channel further, you can consider joining my Patreon, purchasing some of my Teespring merch, or purchasing some of my fiction novels on Amazon. All of the links are below, and of course if you choose not to, please don't feel bad about it. Your continued viewership is more than enough. Mars. The single most explored planet in our solar system, with the obvious exception of Earth. At least the parts of Earth that are above the water. While NASA and other agencies have made some
What if the earliest Buddhist path was far less democratic than modern spirituality wants it?
It's said that truth is stranger than fiction, but sometimes one echoes the other in ways that's decidedly uncanny.
A silver coin minted in the New World traveled across oceans, passed through the hands of Spanish merchants, English pirates, Chinese traders.
Hi, my name's Kevin Hicks. Welcome to the History Squad. Now, today's video is actually a compilation of different films from the 100 Years' War series. We have taken all of those regarding the
army is oh my god, what is this? Like an oncoming most of the French colonies in North America after the 7 Years' War. The goal of this line was to basically
the Half-Life universe is one of science fiction's most intricate and terrifying worlds. At its core, it tells a story about humanity.
December 21st, 1944, just before dawn. In the freezing fog near the Belgian hamlet of Dongbutkenbach, a German officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend checked his watch and prepared to move his men forward. He was a veteran. His division had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy, bled at Caen, survived the collapse of the Falaise Pocket. He'd been trained in the best artillery doctrine in the world, the German system, a system he trusted the way a carpenter trusts his ruler. He knew what American artillery could do. He had seen it. He'd studied the pattern in Italy and heard the reports from France. He also knew something the American gunners didn't want him to know. After the first shells landed, the German artillery manual, the one Rommel had carried across the desert, said you had a window. A few minutes. Maybe longer if the weather was bad. Enough time to push forward, crawl into a fold of the earth, get low. Enough time to survive. It was foggy. That was good. In fog, American observers were blind, and the snow muffled sound. The 12th SS Panzer had over 20 tanks rolling up behind them. 2 battalions of Panzer Grenadiers. Against them, by German intelligence estimates, 1 stretched-out battalion of American infantry, mostly green replacements, holding a 2,100-yard front with both flanks wide open. Then the shells came. Not in a pattern, not with a warning round, not walking toward them across the field the way artillery had been doing since 1914. They came from every direction at the same instant, from the north, from the west, from positions miles to the rear that had no business being able to hit Dom Butgenbach at all. Not a barrage, a ring, a closing ring of steel and fire that seemed to be aimed with an impossible precision at the exact ground his men were standing on. Over the next 4 days, Kampfgruppe Kuhlmann of the 12th SS Panzer Division would hurl itself at Dom Butgenbach again and again. It would fail every time. American graves registration teams would count 782 dead Germans piled in front of a single American battalion's foxholes. 47 burned-out German tanks would litter the frozen fields. But the most important document produced by that battle was not the casualty report. It was the interrogation reports. German officers captured at Dom Butgenbach and along the Elsenborn Ridge said the same thing over and over to American intelligence teams. They said they did not understand what had hit them. They said the shells had come from everywhere at once. They said American fire had found them before they were even in range. They used the same German word again and again. Unbegreiflich. Incomprehensible. These were not conscripts. These were graduates of the finest military education system in the world. They had fought on the Eastern Front. They had survived Kursk. They had studied artillery their entire careers. And they told their American captors that what they had just experienced was, in a literal sense, beyond their understanding. Why? What had the Americans built that baffled the best officers the Wehrmacht could field? What was this ring of fire that violated everything a German